Most organizations believe AWS is winning the cloud war, but they are looking at the wrong battlefield. While AWS still runs more global workloads than any other competitor, enterprise control has shifted to a different arena entirely. The original cloud war focused on infrastructure, specifically who could provision compute fastest, scale storage cheapest, and offer the broadest service catalog. AWS won that war decisively, yet the new conflict centers on something else: identity, policy, and governance across the entire organization. In this environment, Microsoft has positioned itself as the control plane, while AWS continues to build the infrastructure underneath. Over 80% of enterprises are currently hybrid and will remain so through 2027, which is not a failure of cloud migration or a lack of commitment. Hybrid is the architectural end state. In these environments, the winner is not the provider with the most compute, but the one controlling identity, policy, and workflow across the entire organization. That is Microsoft. The infrastructure war is over. AWS won. We should be clear about what AWS actually accomplished. AWS dominates raw market share with 32% of global cloud infrastructure spending and offers 230 services across compute, storage, networking, and AI. With 33 regions and 105 availability zones, they built a mature ecosystem with deep DevOps automation and cost optimization tools that competitors still cannot match. The victory AWS achieved in infrastructure is not in question, as it is a historical fact. However, here is the uncomfortable part, that dominance does not translate to dominance in governance because the battleground has simply moved. Enterprises have stopped asking which cloud they should build on, as that question was settled years ago for most organizations. They asked it, received an answer, and moved on to a completely different problem: how to govern identity and policy across multiple clouds. That question has a different answer. This shift happened gradually, but around 2020, enterprises started noticing a significant problem with their architectural sprawl. They had workloads on AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud, along with on-premises infrastructure they could not decommission. Managing 5 different identity systems became untenable because it meant maintaining 5 different audit trails, 5 compliance frameworks, and 5 different places to revoke access when an employee left the company. The result was a new demand: unified identity. AWS responded to this need with IAM Identity Center, which is a solid product for providing SSO and MFA across AWS accounts. But the architectural truth is that IAM Identity Center originates in AWS and is built specifically for AWS. When you federate it to other platforms, you are extending AWS identity outward and claiming that AWS is the source of truth. Microsoft Entra ID approaches the problem from a different angle. Entra ID originates in the workforce and is built for humans and their applications, rather than just servers. When Entra ID federates with AWS, the Microsoft Identity Engine issues the tokens that grant AWS access, which is not a state of coexistence. It is subordination. The enterprise no longer sees 2 identity systems, but rather one Microsoft system managing access to multiple platforms. That difference in origin matters at scale. When identity originates in one place and governs everywhere, you create control plane gravity that compounds over time. AWS built a cloud for developers and infrastructure teams by optimizing for rapid provisioning, cost flexibility, and regional distribution. All of those features are valuable, but enterprises do not actually run on infrastructure. They run on identity, policy, and workflow. AWS either did not anticipate that shift or decided it was not a battle they wanted to fight. By 2023, the pattern was clear as enterprises standardized on Microsoft 365 for workforce collaboration through Teams, SharePoint, and Outlook. Over 95% of Fortune 500 companies use Microsoft 365, which is not a cloud choice so much as an identity choice. Because governance sits where the work happens, Microsoft owns the enterprise by owning the employee surface area. AWS owns the compute, but Microsoft owns the people. This is the inversion that nobody talks about. The infrastructure war is over, and AWS won, but the enterprise war that determines how organizations actually operate is being decided on different terms. Those terms favor the company that controls identity, not the company that controls instances. What a control plane actually is, we need to define this term precisely because it gets thrown around until it loses all meaning. A control plane is not infrastructure, and it is certainly not a collection of servers. It is the underlying system that governs who accesses what, when they do it, and the specific conditions required for that access to be granted. In the era of traditional enterprise IT, Active Directory functioned as the primary control plane. It sat physically in the data center and controlled which users could log into which machines while managing group memberships and enforcing password policies. Everything in the environment flowed through it because it represented the single authoritative source of truth for identity. In the cloud, the control plane has shifted into something more complex. It is no longer just about managing machines, but rather about identity, policy enforcement, and compliance across every fragmented environment you own. This includes your cloud footprint, your remaining on-premises hardware, the edge, and every SaaS application your employees touch. A modern control plane is defined by three specific architectural components. First, identity must be the origin point. I'm not talking about federation or synchronization, but the actual origin where user accounts are created, managed, and eventually revoked. This is the authoritative source where a person exists first when they join the company and where they are deleted first when they leave. In a functional architecture, every other system is merely downstream from this point. Second, policy must travel with the identity rather than sitting as a static rule in a database. These are dynamic policies that evaluate context in real time to determine if a login should be allowed. The system asks where the user is signing in from, whether their device is compliant, and if their risk profile has suddenly spiked. Based on those shifting signals, the engine can enforce MFA, block access entirely, or demand full device management. This is the reality of conditional access and continuous verification, which stands as the direct opposite of the old model where authentication equaled permanent trust. Third, governance must span every environment instead of being isolated to a single platform. You need one audit trail, one compliance dashboard, and one centralized place to review who has access to what across the entire enterprise. This provides a single location to enforce data residency rules and prove to regulators that you are managing access correctly without jumping between a dozen different consoles. Now let's look at how AWS IAM compares to this model. AWS IAM is a resource-centric system designed specifically to control access to AWS resources. You define roles and attach policies to those roles to specify exactly which actions can be performed on which buckets or instances. An IAM user might assume a role to read from an S3 bucket, while another role allows them to launch EC2 instances. While this is granular and undeniably powerful, the system is fundamentally built around resources, not people. The critical distinction is that AWS IAM does not originate identity for the enterprise. It originates identity specifically for AWS. When you create an IAM user, that user exists within an AWS account rather than within your actual organization. If your company operates multiple AWS accounts, you end up with multiple identity silos that require federation or AWS organizations to manage. Even then, the origin of that identity remains tethered to AWS. Microsoft Entra ID is an identity-centric system that attempts to control access to everything. It starts by asking who the person is, which applications they should access, what data they are allowed to see, and which devices they are using. It originates in the workforce. When you create a user in Entra ID, they are a person in your organizational directory who can access Azure, Microsoft 365, and thousands of SaaS apps. They can even access AWS via SAML or OIDC Trust. When Entra ID federates AWS, the Microsoft Identity Engine is the one issuing the tokens that grant access to the Amazon cloud. The enterprise sees one identity system managing multiple platforms, which effectively turns AWS into just another resource that Entra-authenticated users can access. This is not a state of coexistence, but rather a form of architectural subordination. This distinction matters because of scale and what I call control plane gravity. When identity originates in one place and governs everywhere, that gravity begins to compound over time. Every new application that needs to authenticate users naturally gravitates toward that origin point, and every new policy requiring enforcement moves toward the governance layer. Eventually, that gravity becomes inescapable for the organization. AWS IAM provides roles and policies that are largely static, meaning a user either has permission to access a resource or they do not. Conditional access changes that equation by ensuring permission is evaluated continuously based on context, risk, and location. The same user might have access to sensitive data while sitting in the corporate office but find themselves blocked from that same data while working from a coffee shop in a high-risk country. This is not a simple feature comparison, but a fundamental architectural difference. One system is built around the resources being accessed, while the other is built around the people doing the accessing. In the modern enterprise, people are the control plane, and the resources are always downstream. Entra ID's gravitational pull, 1 billion active users. To understand the weight of this system, you have to look at the sheer scale of the numbers involved. Microsoft Entra ID currently has 1 billion monthly active users, which is not a traditional achievement for Microsoft as much as it is an unavoidable enterprise reality. Entra ID serves as the identity backbone for Microsoft 365, Azure cloud services, and thousands of federated SaaS applications. Increasingly, it is also becoming the primary identity backbone for accessing AWS. Reaching 1 billion active users means Entra ID is now the largest identity platform on the planet. This did not happen by design, but through the sheer force of architectural gravity. When Entra ID federates AWS, the workflow reveals who is actually in charge of the gate. An employee signs into Microsoft Teams using their Entra credentials and then decides they need to access an AWS resource. When they click that link, Entra ID evaluates their identity, their device health, and their current risk profile before issuing a SAML assertion. That assertion is what grants them temporary credentials to to enter AWS. Even though AWS logs the access and manages the resource, Microsoft is the one controlling the gate. That is not a partnership between equals, but a clear architectural hierarchy. This gravitational pull extends far beyond simple identity and into the realm of policy and conditional access. When Entra ID federates AWS, it does not just handle the login, it enforces the organization's rules across the board. A company can set a single rule to block all AWS access from unapproved countries, and that rule applies to every federated user, regardless of which AWS account they are trying to reach. You end up with one policy and one control plane governing multiple platforms. AWS IAM Identity Center is simply not built to do this because it was designed for AWS accounts. It can provide SSO across those accounts and federate external providers, but it does not originate identity for the enterprise. It originates in AWS. So when you connect an external provider to IAM Identity Center, you are just extending the AWS framework outward rather than establishing an external system as the true source of truth. The distinction is subtle, but the architectural consequences are massive. Entra ID's pull is amplified by the fact that Microsoft 365 is ubiquitous, with over 95% of Fortune 500 companies relying on it. This means the identity, the workflow, and the data for the world's largest companies all flow through Microsoft. Teams is where the decisions happen, SharePoint is where the documents live, and Outlook is where the priorities are set. This isn't a commentary on the quality of the software, but a recognition that the actual work of the enterprise happens inside the Microsoft ecosystem. When the work happens in Microsoft, the governance inevitably happens there as well. Approvals move through Power Automate, workflows are built in Power Apps, and compliance boundaries are defined in Purview. An enterprise could choose to run every single bit of its compute on AWS, but the control plane would still belong to Microsoft. AWS owns the infrastructure underneath, but Microsoft owns the employee surface area where the business actually functions. The gravity compounds because it integrates identity with workflow, data, and compliance into a single engine. When Entra ID authenticates a user, it knows exactly who they are, while Teams sees what they are communicating and SharePoint sees what they are creating. Purview then classifies that data for protection, while Defender monitors the device risk profile. All of these signals flow into a single governance engine that AWS has no way to replicate. AWS has identity management and infrastructure security tools, but it does not own the space where the work is performed. Because it doesn't own the employee surface area, it cannot build this kind of unified governance or create this level of control plane gravity. This is why that 1 billion user figure actually matters. It is a statement about where the enterprise control plane lives and which identity engine is responsible for issuing the tokens that grant access to everything else. It tells you exactly who is defining the governance layer that sits on top of all your infrastructure. And that is Microsoft Conditional Access, where policy follows identity. Conditional access is a Microsoft Entra ID feature that evaluates context in real time, and understanding how this works is where the architectural difference between Azure and AWS becomes visceral. Imagine an employee signs in from the corporate office. Conditional access asks if the user is in a trusted location, if their device is compliant, and if their risk profile is elevated. When all signals are green, the system grants access without any friction. Everything changes when that same employee travels to a conference in another country and tries to access the same resource from a hotel. Conditional access asks the same questions, but now the location is untrusted and the risk profile is elevated due to impossible travel. The system does not just grant access, but instead enforces MFA or requires device management verification, and it might even block access entirely depending on the sensitivity of the resource. This is not static role-based access control. In reality, it is dynamic, context-aware governance where the same user might have access to sensitive data from one location but find themselves blocked from that same data in another. The same device might be trusted in one scenario but flagged in another based on the risk profile, and the same application might require MFA for one user while letting another pass through. AWS IAM provides roles and policies that are fundamentally static, meaning a user either has permission to access an S3 bucket or they do not. You can attach a policy that says a user can read objects, but that policy applies everywhere and always without any context evaluation or continuous verification. There is no mechanism to say that access is allowed from here but not from there. AWS uses guard duty for threat detection and security hub for aggregation, but these are detective controls that tell you what went wrong after the fact. They do not prevent access before a breach occurs, whereas conditional access is a preventive mechanism that stops unauthorized access from happening in the first place. This distinction matters enormously in hybrid environments where an employee at a coffee shop gets different treatment than they would at the corporate office. Accessing a cloud application from a compliant device results in a different outcome than using a personal device, and signing in from an approved country is treated differently than signing in from a high-risk region. AWS has no native equivalent to this architectural pattern. While AWS can log the access, alert on anomalies, or revoke credentials after the fact, it cannot prevent the access before it happens based on real-time context. This becomes critical for the control plane because when Entra ID federates AWS, conditional access travels with the identity. An organization can set a rule requiring MFA for all AWS access from outside the network, and that rule applies to every federated user regardless of which AWS account or service they are using. This creates one policy for multiple platforms under one control plane. Microsoft Defender for Cloud amplifies this by monitoring Azure resources and connecting to AWS workloads at the same time. When a security incident occurs in AWS, the response flows through Microsoft's compliance engine, which evaluates the incident against organizational policies and enforces remediation. AWS remains the infrastructure provider, but Microsoft controls the response. The control plane finally becomes visible here. It is not just about authentication, but about authorization that adapts to context and policy that travels with identity across environments. This is continuous verification instead of one-time authentication. AWS Security Hub attempts to aggregate security signals into a dashboard to show you what is happening, but it does not govern identity across platforms or enforce policy on non-AWS infrastructure. Security Hub is a security tool, while the combination of conditional access and Defender is a governance layer. One is a service, one is a control mechanism. In the enterprise, the control mechanism is what determines who actually has access to what. Defender for Cloud, the multi-cloud control plane. Microsoft Defender for Cloud acts as a single pane of glass for security across multiple environments, covering Azure infrastructure, AWS workloads, Google Cloud resources, and on-premises servers via Azure Arc. It also integrates endpoints through Defender for Endpoint, identity through Entra ID, and data through Microsoft Purview. This is not just a feature list, but an architectural inversion. AWS Security Hub attempts something similar by aggregating AWS security signals to show you what is happening in your environment, which is certainly useful. However, Security Hub does not govern identity across platforms or enforce policy on non-AWS infrastructure, making it a dashboard that tells you what went wrong rather than a system that prevents it. The foundational mistake is thinking these are equivalent. When a security incident occurs in AWS, the response flows through Microsoft's compliance engine instead of the AWS engine, allowing Defender to evaluate the incident against organizational policies and enforce remediation. AWS provides the platform, but Microsoft provides the governance, and that is control plane dominance. Consider what this means for daily operations. An organization with workloads on AWS, Azure, on-premises servers, and edge devices would traditionally need 5 different security tools and 5 different alert systems. That creates chaos and security debt, and it is the primary reason most organizations fail to respond to incidents quickly. Defender for Cloud centralizes the signal into one dashboard with one remediation workflow, so an unauthorized access attempt in AWS triggers the same response as one in Azure. The same policy applies and the same escalation process activates, creating one control plane that governs multiple platforms simultaneously. AWS lacks an equivalent because it does not own the identity layer, whereas Defender for Cloud works because it sits directly on top of identity. When Entra ID authenticates a user, Defender knows exactly who they are and monitors their access to AWS resources in real time. When anomalies occur, Defender evaluates them against organizational policy and enforces remediation through a single governance engine. You can integrate AWS Security Hub with third-party tools or automate responses via Lambda, but you are essentially building a governance layer on top of infrastructure from scratch. You are not inheriting a governance layer from a unified identity platform, but rather constructing one from individual components. This matters at scale when you have hundreds of AWS accounts and millions of access events per day, making a unified governance layer an operational necessity. You cannot manually review every alert or enforce every policy, so you need a system that understands context and uses intelligence to manage the load. Defender for Cloud understands context because it is built on identity, meaning it knows the user, their device, their location, and their historical behavior. When anomalies occur, Defender does not just flag them, but instead contextualizes them and enforces policy based on that specific context. AWS Security Hub does not have this context because it sees infrastructure events rather than identity events. It sees that an access event happened, but it does not see the identity context, the device compliance, or the risk profile of the user involved. This is why the control plane matters. Infrastructure is visible, but identity remains invisible until something goes wrong, and Defender for Cloud is what finally makes identity and policy enforcement visible across every platform. AWS will likely continue to dominate in raw infrastructure scale and offer more services than any other competitor. However, AWS will not control the governance layer that sits on top of that infrastructure, as that layer belongs to Microsoft. That layer is where enterprise security actually lives, where policy is enforced, and where compliance is proven. That is the control plane, and that is where the enterprise battle is being decided. Sentinel and Purview, compliance as control. Microsoft Sentinel is often described as a SIEM, a tool that simply ingests logs from AWS, Azure, and your on-premises SaaS applications to centralize the signal. Most organizations believe it is just a high-end log aggregator where you can see everything happening across your infrastructure. They are wrong. Architecturally, Sentinel is the compliance backbone where policy enforcement becomes visible and governance finally becomes auditable. Microsoft Purview sits directly on top of that signal to add a layer of compliance governance that the underlying infrastructure cannot provide. Purview is the engine that enforces data classification, manages retention policies, and handles the complexities of e-discovery and insider risk. Because it enforces data loss prevention across Teams, SharePoint, and Exchange, you are looking at a single governance engine that dictates behavior across multiple platforms. Consider the operational reality of proving GDPR compliance to a regulator who demands to see how you manage sensitive data. You need to demonstrate exactly where that data lives, who touched it, and what happened to that information the moment an employee left the company. The traditional approach involves auditing 5 different systems with 5 different frameworks, resulting in months of work and thousands of dollars spent on a fragmented audit trail. The Sentinel and Purview approach replaces that chaos with a unified audit trail and a single dashboard to prove consistent policy enforcement. When a document is classified as sensitive, Purview recognizes the state, Sentinel logs the access, and DLP blocks any attempt to share it externally. This is a deterministic model where the document owner's departure triggers an automatic retention policy, providing one version of the truth for your compliance proof. AWS has no functional equivalent to this because AWS config is limited to infrastructure compliance rather than data governance. While AWS config can tell you if an S3 bucket is encrypted or if an EC2 instance is configured correctly, it cannot manage a retention policy or enforce DLP. AWS provides the virtual hardware, but Microsoft provides the compliance layer, and in regulated industries like finance or healthcare, that layer is the only thing that matters. When an enterprise needs to prove HIPAA compliance, they don't look to their cloud provider, they look to their compliance officer. That officer uses Purview to classify data and Entra ID to manage identity, because that is where the control plane actually lives. The infrastructure has become a commodity, but the ability to prove that a policy was enforced is the ultimate differentiator. This is why enterprises standardize on Microsoft for their most sensitive regulated workloads. It is not because Azure infrastructure is inherently superior to AWS or because the services have more features. It is because Microsoft owns the audit trail and the proof of enforcement. Even when an organization runs a workload on AWS, they still extend Purview and Sentinel across that environment to maintain control. That is the control plane at work. AWS provides the workload, but Microsoft provides the governance that makes that workload legal to operate. In the world of enterprise IT, control is what the regulators demand and what the organization pays for. The battle for the enterprise is not being decided by cost per compute hour, but by the ability to enforce policy consistently across every platform. AWS will never win this specific battle because they do not own the identity foundation. Without identity, you can build security tools and monitoring systems, but you cannot build a true governance layer. Governance requires a deterministic identity model as its starting point, and that identity belongs to Microsoft. The M365 gravity well, where enterprise work happens. Over 95% of Fortune 500 companies use Microsoft 365, a number that represents where the actual work of the enterprise occurs. This isn't just about IT mandates or licensing bundles, it's about where the organizational memory is stored and where decisions are documented. Teams is no longer just a chat app. It is the virtual conference room where executives make the choices that shape the company's future. SharePoint has replaced the file server as the place where every governed document lives, stays, or eventually dies. When a file needs to be discovered during litigation or deleted according to a legal hold, it happens within the SharePoint architecture. Exchange serves a similar role for communication, acting as the permanent archive that regulators check when they need to see who knew what and when they knew it. We are not discussing the subjective quality of these products or whether Teams is better than Slack in a vacuum. The reality is one of ubiquity, where the actual work of the enterprise happens inside the Microsoft 365 ecosystem. Because the work happens there, the governance must happen there as well, making the two concepts architecturally inseparable. Every approval that flows through Power Automate relies on Entra ID to know who the approver is and conditional access to check their context. Sentinel watches the entire process, logging the approval to ensure the workflow remains compliant with the organization's stated intent. You are not just using a tool, you are operating within a policy layer that governs the entire life cycle of an action. Custom applications built in Power Apps follow this same logic by authenticating users through Entra ID and enforcing roles defined in the identity platform. When a document is created, Purview classifies it immediately and DLP prevents it from leaving the boundaries of the organization. This integrated governance means that even if your compute lives on AWS, your control plane is still firmly rooted in Microsoft. AWS does not own the employee surface area, which means they cannot build this type of integrated governance. This is the gravity well. Work happens in M365, identity flows through Entra, and policy is enforced by conditional access. All of these signals flow into Sentinel, creating a unified control plane that AWS simply cannot replicate from the infrastructure layer. An enterprise might choose AWS for 80% of its raw compute power, but they remain 100% Microsoft by governance and control. They rely on Microsoft for the place where decisions are made, archived, and eventually audited. AWS can provide the storage and the AI infrastructure, but they cannot provide the layer that makes that work auditable. That distinction matters because it defines who actually owns the enterprise relationship. The gravity well ensures that as long as work happens in the Microsoft suite, the governance will follow. Microsoft owns the place where work happens, and that is why the control plane belongs to them, regardless of where the servers are located. Copilot is control plane acceleration. Microsoft Copilot for Microsoft 365 is not merely an AI feature, but rather a governance accelerator that makes the control plane narrative impossible to ignore. To function safely within an enterprise environment, Copilot requires specific architectural foundations like data classification, identity scoping, and rigid compliance boundaries. Without these guardrails, the system cannot operate reliably, and the tool quickly transforms from a productivity asset into a massive liability. Consider the actual behavior of the system as it reads your emails, scans your documents, and synthesizes your entire chat history into automated insights. This process becomes a data breach waiting to happen if the engine lacks the context to know which documents are sensitive or which regulated data must remain siloed. Because the system lacks inherent intent, it will process whatever it can reach, making the underlying authorization graph the only thing standing between utility and catastrophe. This reality forces organizations to strengthen their control plane before they can even begin a deployment. You find yourself needing Purview to classify the data and DLP to enforce boundaries, while Entra ID scopes access based on the specific role and context of the user. To maintain oversight, you then need Sentinel to audit what the engine is reading, alongside conditional access to ensure that only authorized actors can trigger these features. Enterprises are moving toward Copilot because the productivity gains are real, but they are finding that adoption is not governance optional. You cannot deploy this technology without first hardening your governance layer, which creates a functional lock-in that is rarely discussed in marketing materials. While AWS offers Bedrock as a service for hosting and fine-tuning models, it remains a piece of infrastructure rather than a control mechanism. Bedrock is a substrate that allows you to run models however you like, but it does not mandate that you classify your data or implement identity governance to function. Copilot is different because it is architecturally inseparable from governance. It forces you to confront your access management and audit trails because the alternative is conditional chaos within your most sensitive data sets. As organizations adopt these tools, they aren't just buying AI. They are deepening their structural dependence on Microsoft's governance stack. Every query and every recommendation makes Entra ID and Purview more essential to daily operations, turning these security tools into the literal heartbeat of the business. AWS cannot replicate this dynamic because they do not own the employee surface area where work actually happens. Copilot succeeds because it lives inside Teams, Outlook, and SharePoint, whereas AWS lacks the hooks into the daily workflow to force this kind of governance hardening. They can host the models and provide the raw inference power, but they cannot create a feature that accelerates the control plane because they do not own the interface. This isn't a coercive tactic, but a functional reality where the Microsoft control plane becomes more valuable the more you use it. Once this layer becomes critical to your operations, the cost of switching to another provider becomes astronomical. Removing Entra ID or Purview would mean dismantling your entire identity and data governance framework, leaving you with a security vacuum that is nearly impossible to fill. Choosing Copilot is a strategic decision to prioritize the governance layer over the infrastructure layer, eventually making the underlying hardware irrelevant. Azure Arc, managing everything everywhere. Azure Arc represents the software-defined control plane for hybrid infrastructure, serving as the most tangible example of the architectural inversion I've been describing. It allows you to project Azure Policy and Defender onto infrastructure you don't even own, including on-premises servers and AWS EC2 instances. By installing a lightweight agent, these external resources appear in your Azure portal as managed objects, effectively pulling your competitors' hardware into your own governance model. This is not an extension of infrastructure, but a projection of policy. While AWS Outpost tries to solve the hybrid problem by putting AWS-managed hardware in your data center, It keeps you trapped inside their specific APIs and hardware lifecycle. Outposts is a hardware play that locks you into a specific vendor's metal, whereas Arc is a software play that abstracts the hardware entirely. In the enterprise, software always wins because that is where the actual control of the system lies. When you install the Arc agent on a legacy on-premises server, that machine suddenly behaves like a native Azure resource. You can enforce security baselines, require specific encryption standards, and manage firewall rules through the same policy engine that governs your cloud footprint. The same logic applies to your AWS instances, allowing you to monitor them with Azure Monitor and protect them with Defender under a single unified framework. This is the definition of control plane abstraction. You are essentially stating that the location of the infrastructure is irrelevant as long as the policy is enforced consistently across the entire environment. AWS cannot offer a true equivalent because their DNA is fundamentally infrastructure-focused, meaning they excel at managing their own hardware but struggle to provide a unified governance layer for their competitors' platforms. Arc treats infrastructure as a mere substrate, allowing the governance layer to remain constant while the hardware becomes interchangeable. For an enterprise with a messy mix of on-premises workloads and multi-cloud deployments, this solves the problem of operational chaos. Instead of juggling 3 different management frameworks and 3 different sets of dashboards, you move toward a single compliance engine where Azure policy applies everywhere. This shift represents a fundamental change in how we design systems. You no longer choose a hardware provider and then try to figure out how to secure it. Instead, you choose a governance framework and then decide which infrastructure fits within those rules. Microsoft built this abstraction layer while AWS was still focused on building better virtual machines, and that distinction in architectural philosophy is now becoming a major competitive advantage. Arc also enables a policy as code model that is truly platform agnostic. While tools like CloudFormation are powerful, they are generally confined to the AWS ecosystem and do not help you manage your data center or other clouds. Arc policy applies everywhere because it is focused on the intent of the configuration rather than the specifics of the underlying provider. Enterprises aren't adopting Arc because Azure's compute is better, but because Microsoft's governance model is more comprehensive and easier to enforce at scale. Entra Kerberos and cloud-only identities. Entra Kerberos is a cloud-native authentication protocol that finally kills off a fundamental architectural requirement that has haunted enterprise environments for decades. Historically, if you wanted Kerberos authentication, you needed Active Directory domain controllers living on premises. That was a non-negotiable law of the data center. Accessing file shares or using Kerberos-based security meant you had to maintain a domain controller, ensure constant line-of-sight connectivity, and swallow the massive infrastructure overhead that came with it. Entra Kerberos changes that equation completely. This shift makes Entra ID the KDC, the key distribution center. Instead of relying on a physical box in a server room to issue Kerberos tickets, Entra ID handles the heavy lifting from the cloud. An employee using an Entra joint laptop can now authenticate to Azure files without ever talking to an on-premises domain controller. They can jump into an Azure Virtual Desktop session without a VPN tunnel back to the home office, allowing them to work from anywhere while maintaining full Kerberos security. This is not just a new feature, it is a massive architectural shift. To understand the operational impact, you have to look at the old way of doing things. Traditionally, migrating file servers to Azure created a specific kind of architectural friction, because while Azure File supports SMB and SMB supports Kerberos, Kerberos always required a KDC. You were trapped in a cycle where you either kept your aging on-premises domain controllers running or you settled for weaker, less secure authentication methods. Entra Kerberos removes that trap by turning Entra ID into the KDC itself. Cloud-only identities, users who exist solely in Entra ID with no footprint in a local AD, can now authenticate to Azure files using pure Kerberos. The entire flow is cloud-native, which means you no longer need on-premises infrastructure, VPN tunnels, or fragile line-of-sight dependencies to keep things running. The implications here are significant for any organization looking to decouple from legacy hardware. You can now decommission your domain controllers, shut down your local identity systems, and operate entirely in the cloud with enterprise-grade encryption. Kerberos is no longer a legacy protocol tied to a server rack. It has been redefined as a cloud-native tool. AWS has no real answer to this because they don't own the enterprise identity layer in the first place. Since AWS IAM is built to manage resources rather than identities, they cannot offer a cloud-only identity infrastructure or turn their platform into a KDC. They simply don't own the foundational layer required to build this kind of authentication architecture. Entra Kerberos is the technical manifestation of control plane gravity. It strips away the last valid architectural reason to keep identity infrastructure on premises, as organizations no longer need local domain controllers for basic authentication. Entra ID handles the entire stack in a way that is scalable, governed, and entirely cloud-native. This matters because it accelerates the inevitable move toward cloud-only architectures. Organizations that used to struggle with hybrid identity setups and complex synchronization can now cut the cord and move everything to the cloud. They eliminate the mess of managing two separate identity systems and the administrative debt that comes with synchronization errors. When an organization moves to a cloud-only identity model, they aren't just using a Microsoft service, they are embedding themselves deeper into the ecosystem. Entra ID becomes the sole source of truth and a non-negotiable part of daily operations. The control plane becomes more visible and more essential to the business than ever before. This is how gravity works in practice. Entra Kerberos doesn't force you to use Azure through a contract, but you adopt it because it solves the very real problem of legacy infrastructure dependencies. However, that choice makes Entra ID strategically dominant, increasing the importance of the control plane and making the cost of switching nearly impossible to justify. Once your identity stack lives in Entra ID and your file servers rely on Entra Kerberos, you cannot easily migrate to a different provider. Moving to AWS identity infrastructure becomes a functional nightmare rather than a simple business decision. You are locked in not by a salesperson, but by the functional necessity of your own architecture. That is the kind of architectural lock-in that actually matters in the enterprise. It isn't about your licensing agreement or a signed commitment. It's about the fact that Entra ID is now the foundation of your entire environment. If you remove that layer, everything else stops working immediately. AWS will likely never compete here because they focus on compute, storage, and databases rather than the identity layer. Microsoft owns the foundational piece that makes all those other services function. Entra Kerberos is just one more mechanism designed to deepen that control and ensure the center of gravity stays exactly where it is. The hybrid inevitability, 90% by 2027. Gartner predicts that 90% of organizations will adopt a hybrid cloud model by 2027. We should be very clear about what that number represents. This isn't a guess that most companies will try hybrid and fail to reach the real cloud, nor is it a forecast of a temporary transition phase. This is a statement that hybrid cloud is the final architectural end state for the enterprise. This shift isn't happening because organizations failed their cloud migrations or couldn't afford the bill. It is happening because hybrid is the optimal way to run a business. It is the only architecture that actually aligns with how large-scale enterprises operate in the real world. Hybrid setups allow organizations to solve for data residency in a way that pure cloud cannot match. Sensitive or regulated data stays on-premises to satisfy legal requirements, while elastic workloads and AI training scale out to cloud GPUs. This isn't a compromise made out of weakness. It is a deliberate optimization of resources and compliance. You also get cost benefits that a pure cloud model struggles to provide. Predictable, steady-state workloads run on-premises where you can own the hardware and amortize the cost over several years. Meanwhile, your bursty or experimental workloads run in the cloud where you only pay for what you use. This isn't a failure to migrate. It is a mature strategy that matches infrastructure to the specific needs of the workload. Latency is another area where hybrid wins. Real-time processing and edge inference happen on-site where every millisecond counts, while the heavy lifting of model training happens in the cloud where resources are plentiful. Keeping data close to the point of use means network latency stops being a bottleneck for your most critical applications. Finally, hybrid provides a level of security isolation that the pure cloud model lacks. Legacy systems that are too risky to modernize can stay on-premises, completely air-gapped from the cloud, while your modern apps run with cloud-native security. You aren't trying to force every single app into one rigid model, which shows architectural maturity rather than a lack of progress. The 90% forecast isn't an aspirational goal. It is a description of where the market is already going. Hybrid is the most efficient architecture for practical operations, and that reality changes the entire competitive landscape. In a hybrid world, the most important question is no longer which cloud are we using, but who is governing the whole thing. The first era of the cloud wars was about where to build, and that favored AWS. They had the most services, the most regions, and the most mature tools for developers. When organizations asked where they should put their new workloads, the answer was almost always AWS, and as a result, AWS won that initial round of the fight. But the new question is about who governs identity and policy across multiple environments, and that favors Microsoft. Because Microsoft owns the enterprise identity and the governance layer, they are the natural answer for any organization trying to manage a split environment. They extend their control plane across AWS workloads and on-premises servers alike, and in that arena, Microsoft wins. This is a total architectural inversion. In a pure cloud world, the provider with the best infrastructure wins, but in a hybrid world, the provider with the best control plane takes the lead. AWS was built for the first world, while Microsoft has spent decades preparing for the second. By 2027, when nearly everyone is hybrid, the original debate over which cloud is better will become irrelevant. Most companies will already be using AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud simultaneously. The real battle will be over how to govern that complexity, and that is a conversation that Microsoft completely dominates. This is why the hybrid forecast is so important. It isn't just a market stat, it's a signal of which architectural concerns are going to matter most in the coming years. It tells us that the control plane, the identity, the policy, and the governance is the only thing that determines a competitive advantage in a fragmented environment. AWS will likely continue to lead in raw infrastructure and run more total workloads than anyone else. But Microsoft will be the one defining how those workloads are governed and who has access to them. They will set the rules for policy and compliance across the entire industry. That is the inevitability of the hybrid model. It is the reason why the control plane belongs to Microsoft, regardless of where the actual servers are located. The licensing lock-in, enterprise agreements, and bundling. Microsoft Enterprise Agreements bundle services together in a way that AWS fundamentally cannot replicate. To understand why the control plane story is actually a financial one, we have to look at what an EA actually contains. An enterprise agreement typically bundles Microsoft 365 E5, which covers the core of daily work through Teams, Exchange, SharePoint, and OneDrive. It includes Microsoft Entra ID P2 for identity governance and privileged identity management, alongside Microsoft Defender for cloud to monitor security across Azure, AWS, and on-premises environments. The bundle also provides Microsoft Sentinel for centralized security management, Microsoft Purview for data classification and risk detection, and Microsoft Copilot to integrate AI into every workflow. This is not a simple feature list. It is an architectural lock-in. When an enterprise signs an EA, they are doing more than just purchasing software licenses. They are committing to Microsoft as their primary control plane. By signing that contract, the organization is stating that Microsoft will serve as the foundation for how they govern identity, enforce policy, and operate securely. AWS cannot offer an equivalent bundle because they do not own the workforce software layer. While AWS can provide compute, storage, databases, and AI infrastructure, they cannot offer identity governance that is natively integrated with your daily workflow. They cannot provide compliance tools that live inside your productivity applications, and they certainly cannot offer an AI assistant that is baked into Teams. Because of this, enterprises seeking unified governance choose Microsoft. Once that choice is made, they naturally extend Microsoft's reach across their existing AWS workloads. They use Entra ID to authenticate their AWS users and Defender for cloud to monitor their AWS infrastructure. They rely on Sentinel to log access and Purview to classify data living in AWS buckets. The result is that Microsoft's governance is layered directly on top of AWS infrastructure. This is the inherent advantage of bundling. It is not necessarily that Microsoft's individual products outperform AWS alternatives on a feature-by-feature basis. The reality is that Microsoft's products are integrated, meaning they share data and enforce consistent policy without requiring you to glue 5 different third-party tools together. The glue is built into the license. An organization signs an EA and receives Microsoft 365, which ensures that work happens in Teams and identity originates in Entra ID. Security monitoring flows through Defender, audit trails live in Sentinel, and compliance is enforced through Purview. When those same organizations run AWS workloads, they need a way to govern them. Microsoft owns the control plane, so Microsoft governs the AWS workloads. The licensing advantage is profound because it scales with the organization. An enterprise with 5,000 employees needs M365 and Entra ID for every single person, and they need Defender and Purview to maintain their operational foundation. These licenses become non-negotiable because they are the bedrock of how the company functions. AWS cannot compete here because they do not own the foundational layer of the business. They might offer better compute or more performant databases, but they cannot offer better identity governance when they don't own the identity itself. They cannot bundle governance with productivity because they do not own the productivity suite. This is why enterprises extend Microsoft across AWS. It isn't because Azure services are more feature-rich, but because Microsoft owns the bundle and the integration that comes with it. Once an organization commits to this bundle, the cost of switching becomes astronomical. You cannot easily remove Entra ID without dismantling your entire identity management strategy. You cannot pull out Defender or Sentinel without losing your security monitoring and audit trails. The EA is an architectural commitment rather than a simple licensing deal. It is a declaration that Microsoft's control plane is the foundation of the organization. Once that foundation is set, the underlying AWS infrastructure becomes less strategically important. AWS becomes the place where workloads run, but Microsoft remains the place where governance happens. That is the reality of the licensing lock-in. Enterprises standardize on Microsoft because the control plane makes everything else work. Regulated industries, where control plane dominance is absolute. In healthcare, finance, and government, compliance is an existential requirement rather than an optional configuration. Regulators are not interested in your infrastructure. They care if you can prove that data is protected and access is strictly controlled. This is where the control plane shifts from being a benefit to being a mandatory requirement. These industries require specific hard guarantees. They need residency protections, tamper-proof audit trails, and insider risk detection that catches threats before a breach occurs. They need DLP enforcement to stop sensitive data from leaving the perimeter, and role-based access control that is enforced at every single layer. Microsoft Purview provides this entire framework across M365, Azure, and even federated AWS environments. When a healthcare provider needs to prove HIPAA compliance, they do not start by auditing their EC2 instances. They audit their data flows and check who accessed patient records. They look at whether DLP policies stopped unauthorized sharing. Purview answers those questions and provides the audit trail that proves compliance to the regulator. AWS offers AWS config for infrastructure compliance, which is useful for verifying that EC2 instances are configured correctly or that S3 buckets are encrypted. However, AWS config does not govern data or manage retention policies. It is a tool for hardening the compute layer, but it is not a complete compliance solution. There is a critical distinction here that regulated industries understand perfectly. AWS is compliant with HIPAA, meaning their data centers are secure and their encryption is strong, but Microsoft's governance layer is what actually enforces HIPAA for the organization. When a healthcare company runs a regulated workload on AWS, they still rely on Purview for data governance. They still need Sentinel to audit record access and Entra ID to manage identity through context-aware policies. They require the entire Microsoft governance stack even when the infrastructure belongs to AWS. This creates a strange inversion. AWS provides the compliant infrastructure, but Microsoft provides the compliant governance. In these industries, the governance is what matters because the infrastructure has become a commodity. Every major cloud provider meets the basic regulatory requirements for storage and compute. The real differentiator is the governance layer that makes those requirements provable to an auditor. When the regulator arrives, the organization doesn't show them a list of AWS servers. They show them the Purview compliance dashboard and the Sentinel audit logs. Financial services experience these same pressures. To prove SOX compliance, a bank must demonstrate that access to critical systems is controlled and that insider threats are being monitored. Purview handles this natively, while AWS config simply cannot reach that level of data-centric oversight. Government agencies face the most intense requirements of all, including FedRAMP, NIST, and CMMC frameworks. These standards demand centralized identity management and comprehensive continuous monitoring. Microsoft's governance layer was built to address these specific needs. While AWS infrastructure can be FedRAMP compliant, AWS does not own the governance layer that actually proves it. This is where control plane dominance becomes absolute. In these sectors, the control plane is the entire business. Organizations do not choose between AWS and Azure based on how fast a virtual machine boots up. They choose based on which platform allows them to survive an audit. Microsoft owns this space entirely. AWS will continue to provide the hardware and the compliant data centers, but Microsoft will continue to own the governance layer. In the world of regulated industries, that is the only thing that determines the winner. That is where the battle for the enterprise is being won. Government and sovereign cloud, where Microsoft's advantage is structural. Most organizations view sovereign clouds as a simple matter of data residency, but they are wrong. Microsoft operates specialized regions in territories where data sovereignty is a non-negotiable requirement of doing business. You see this in Germany through Deutsche Telekom, in China via 21 ViaNet, and across the US government with GCC, GCC High, and DoD variants. These are not merely infrastructure regions designed to host virtual machines, they are governance containers where the system enforces boundaries by design. Within these walls, identity remains local, data stays put, and regulators can perform audits because nothing leaves the perimeter without explicit authorization. AWS maintains similar footprints with GovCloud and various international regions, yet a fundamental architectural gap remains. While AWS can host the underlying infrastructure in these sensitive locations, they do not own the governance layer that sits on top of that hardware. The US government still runs its workforce collaboration on Microsoft 365, meaning that even in the most restricted GCC high environments, the control plane belongs to Microsoft. Decisions are made in teams, documents live in SharePoint, and communications are archived in Exchange, while Entra ID serves as the origin for every identity. Security is monitored through Defender, and audit trails are consolidated in Sentinel, creating a reality where Microsoft manages the entire operational context. This distinction matters because it is a structural reality rather than a simple feature comparison or product evaluation. We are looking at a scenario where Microsoft owns the entire stack in sovereign environments while AWS is relegated to providing the substrate. AWS provides the raw infrastructure, but Microsoft provides the governance that makes that infrastructure usable for a regulated agency. Consider the operational consequences for a government agency running a multi-cloud strategy within GCC High. They might have workloads sitting in AWS and Azure simultaneously alongside legacy on-premises systems, yet they still require a unified way to manage them all. Microsoft provides that bridge because Entra ID authenticates the users and conditional access enforces the policies across the entire environment. Defender monitors the AWS instances while Sentinel logs the access and Purview ensures compliance, meaning the entire governance layer is a Microsoft engine operating within the sovereign boundary. AWS cannot replicate this model because they do not own the identity system or the policy engine required to authenticate users and enforce context-aware access. They can provide compliant racks and power, but they cannot provide the overarching framework that proves to a regulator that every policy is being strictly enforced. This structural advantage repeats itself in every sovereign region across the globe. In Germany, the data and identity stay local, but the system that determines who has access and what they can do still belongs to Microsoft. For government agencies, this is the decisive factor that outweighs compute performance or storage capacity every single time. They aren't buying features. They are buying the ability to operate within a sovereign boundary using a single unified governance model. This is why government adoption consistently favors Microsoft, regardless of whether Azure infrastructure is better in a vacuum. Microsoft owns the identity, the policy, the compliance, and the audit trail, all contained within the required sovereignty boundary. AWS will continue to provide the underlying infrastructure, but they will never control the layer where the government actually operates and where compliance is ultimately proven. As agencies adopt Teams, SharePoint, and Outlook, this structural advantage compounds and the control plane becomes even more critical to daily operations. The implementation of Copilot only deepens this dependence, and as agencies move toward cloud-only identities via Entra Kerberos, they eliminate their old on-premises footprint entirely. The real advantage isn't found in current products, but in the architectural foundation of the companies themselves. Microsoft built the control plane first and attached infrastructure to it, whereas AWS built infrastructure and tried to bolt on governance as an afterthought. In sovereign environments where governance is the entire business, that original architectural intent determines the winner. By 2027, the shift to cloud-only identities and the rollout of AI across the workforce will make this advantage feel insurmountable. AWS will still be a viable, compliant platform for hosting workloads, but Microsoft will control the decision engine that dictates every action within the environment. In the world of regulated industries and government contracts, that structural ownership of the control plane is the only thing that actually matters. The CIO's dilemma: unified control versus best-of-breed services. CIOs are currently facing a choice that sounds perfectly rational in a boardroom but reveals a massive hidden cost once it hits production. They have to choose between a unified control plane and a best-of-breed service model, and this is where architectural theory turns into a painful budget decision. A unified control plane means committing to a single vendor like Microsoft to handle identity, policy, compliance, and security monitoring through a single integrated stack. You use Entra ID for identity, conditional access for your policy engine, Purview for compliance, and Sentinel as your CM. While the cost per service might be higher because you are paying for deep integration, the trade-off is a simplified operation with one dashboard and one consistent governance model. The alternative is the best-of-breed approach, where you pick the absolute best tool for every specific job in the enterprise. You might choose Okta for identity, Splunk for your SIEM, and a specialized vendor for DLP because you want the most advanced solution for every individual function. On paper, this looks cheaper because you only buy exactly what you need, but the operational complexity begins to multiply the moment the contracts are signed. Best of breed sounds superior in theory because nobody wants to accept an inferior tool just for the sake of integration. However, this model almost always fails at enterprise scale because it ignores the reality of system entropy. When you manage 10 different vendors, you are actually managing 10 different identity systems with 10 different credential stores and 10 different password policies. If an employee changes their password in one system and it fails to propagate to the others, they are immediately locked out of half their tools. Support tickets start to pile up and productivity drops because the systems aren't talking to each other in a meaningful way. Compliance becomes a theater performance when you have to pull logs from 10 different vendors who all use different data formats. One might use JSON while another uses syslog, forcing your team to spend weeks normalizing and correlating data just to prove a single access event to a regulator. This isn't true compliance. It's a desperate attempt to reconstruct a narrative from fragmented pieces of evidence. Security posture also suffers because you end up with 10 different policy frameworks that don't share the same standards. One vendor might enforce MFA while another allows weak passwords, creating a fragmented environment where an attacker only needs to find the single weakest link to succeed. Your security is no longer a cohesive shield. It is a collection of mismatched plates with gaps in between them. The maintenance burden is the final nail in the coffin, as every integration between these disparate tools becomes a potential failure point. You have to write custom code to make the identity system talk to the SIEM, and the SIEM talk to the ticketing system, and all of it breaks the moment a vendor updates an API. You also stop hiring cloud architects and start hiring specialists who only know how to run specific point solutions. Training and hiring costs skyrocket because your team is focused on mastering tools that might be obsolete or acquired within a few years. This is the true hidden cost of the best-of-breed strategy. It isn't the price of the software, but the massive overhead of managing the fragmentation. A unified control plane eliminates these friction points by providing one authentication mechanism, one policy engine, and one provable audit trail. You pay more for the individual services, but you pay significantly less overall because you aren't funding 10 different integration projects or 10 different specialist teams. This is the core of the CIO's dilemma, where the best-of-breed approach wins the technical debate, but the unified control plane wins the business reality. Enterprises choose Microsoft not because every individual tool is the market leader, but because the platform offers a single place where policy is actually enforced. AWS cannot offer this level of cohesion because they do not own the identity or the workflow layers of the stack. Once an enterprise chooses Microsoft for that unified control, they inevitably extend that governance across their AWS workloads, and the battle for the control plane is over. The architectural inversion: infrastructure subordinate to governance. For decades, the hierarchy of enterprise IT was built entirely around infrastructure. You had a data center team to manage physical servers, a network team to handle connectivity, and a storage team to oversee capacity. These groups operated in rigid silos, reporting up different chains and optimizing for completely different metrics. In that world, infrastructure was the primary organizing principle, and every other concern was secondary. Cloud computing flattened that hierarchy almost overnight. Suddenly, infrastructure became a commodity you could buy off a shelf. You no longer needed a dedicated data center team because someone else owned the building, and you didn't need to manage physical hardware because providers handled the maintenance for you. Compute, storage, and networking all transformed into services, which meant infrastructure was no longer a scarce resource or a meaningful constraint. When infrastructure stops being scarce, the bottleneck shifts elsewhere. The new scarcity is governance. The new constraint is policy. The real struggle now is the ability to enforce consistent rules across a messy, fragmented collection of platforms. And this is the architectural inversion. While organizations used to be built around their hardware, they are now being rebuilt around their governance models. Infrastructure has become subordinate, while governance has become the primary driver of design. Think about how this changes your day-to-day operations. In the old model, you picked an infrastructure provider first, deciding to build on AWS or Azure before you ever worried about oversight. Governance was an afterthought, something you figured out only after the servers were already running. Infrastructure was the big decision, and governance just followed along behind it. In this new model, you choose your governance framework before you do anything else. You decide that identity will originate in Entra ID, that policy will be enforced through conditional access, and that compliance will live in Purview. Only after those rules are set do you figure out where the actual workloads should live. Governance is now the foundational decision, and the infrastructure simply follows. This inversion gives Microsoft a massive home field advantage because they built their ecosystem around governance from day one. They prioritized identity, policy enforcement, and compliance frameworks long before they ever worried about the underlying hardware. AWS took the opposite path by building world-class infrastructure first and trying to bolt on governance later. As a result, AWS governance still feels like a tool for managing servers rather than a system for managing an entire enterprise. When infrastructure is subordinate to governance, the provider who owns the rules wins the contract. AWS might still be the best infrastructure provider on the planet, offering more services, more regions, and more mature optimization tools than anyone else. But here is the uncomfortable truth. Enterprises aren't optimizing for infrastructure anymore. They are optimizing for control. This isn't a temporary trend or a passing phase in the industry. It is an architectural shift that reflects what modern businesses actually need to survive. They need to enforce policy consistently across every single platform they use, and they need to prove that compliance to regulators with audit trails that cannot be faked. These are governance problems, not hardware problems. AWS can solve infrastructure problems with brilliant efficiency, but they struggle with governance because that layer requires owning the identity of the user. AWS does not own the identity layer. Microsoft does. This architectural inversion will only accelerate as we move toward 2027. As nearly every enterprise adopts a multi-cloud strategy and identity replaces the network as the new perimeter, governance becomes the only thing that stays constant. Infrastructure is becoming interchangeable while the control plane is becoming the only strategic asset that matters. The organization of the future will be built entirely around this governance layer. You will choose your framework, likely Microsoft, and then treat infrastructure providers like plug-and-play components. You might run some workloads on AWS, some on Azure, and keep others on premises, but your policy will be unified, your identity will be centralized, and your audit trails will be complete. That is the reality of the architectural inversion. The control plane belongs to Microsoft, not because their servers are better, but because the servers themselves aren't the point anymore. Governance is what matters, and Microsoft owns the engine that runs it. Steel manning AWS, why they still matter. AWS is not losing this fight, and I want to be very clear about that. What we are seeing is not a defeat, but a repositioning of where AWS fits into the stack. That distinction matters. AWS remains the undisputed heavyweight champion of infrastructure. That isn't a controversial opinion. It is a measurable fact backed by 15 years of relentless expansion. Their advantages aren't just theoretical ideas on a slide deck. They are operational realities that companies rely on every single day. And if you look at raw service breadth, AWS is still in a league of its own with over 230 services. They offer everything from basic compute and storage to quantum computing and specialized machine learning tools. This wasn't an accident, but the result of a decade and a half of building an ecosystem so deep that if you can imagine a cloud service, AWS probably already has a mature version of it. Their global footprint is equally dominant, spanning 33 regions and over 100 availability zones. If your application is sensitive to latency or you have to meet strict data residency laws in obscure locations, AWS is usually the only provider that can actually deliver. That kind of reach is incredibly valuable for global enterprises. Beyond the hardware, AWS dominates in the maturity of its DevOps tooling. Organizations have spent years and millions of dollars building automation on top of CloudFormation, Systems Manager, and Code Deploy. They have teams of experts who understand the AWS way of doing things down to the bone. You don't just throw away that level of institutional knowledge and technical investment because a competitor has a better identity play. They also lead the way in cost optimization. Between savings plans, spot instances, and the compute optimizer, AWS gives you the most granular tools to squeeze every bit of value out of your spend. For a company running at massive scale, the visibility and efficiency AWS provides can save them tens of millions of dollars a year. Even in the AI race, AWS is holding its ground by focusing on the heavy lifting. With Bedrock, SageMaker, and their own custom Trainium and Inferentia chips, they provide the raw power for companies that want to build and fine-tune their own proprietary models. They are providing the flexibility that developers crave. AWS will continue to dominate these specific areas for the foreseeable future. They will likely continue to run more workloads than anyone else and maintain the most sophisticated catalog of tools. These strengths aren't going anywhere, but the repositioning is happening nonetheless. AWS is moving from being the cloud to being the infrastructure layer that Microsoft governs. This isn't a failure, it's just a different way of being dominant. Look at how this works in practice. A company might run 80% of its actual compute power on AWS, which is a massive win for Amazon's bottom line. But that same company uses Entra ID for identity, conditional access for security, and Purview for compliance. Their audit logs sit in Sentinel, and their employees use Copilot for daily tasks. In this scenario, the control plane is Microsoft, but the engine room is AWS. AWS isn't losing that deal. They are winning the workload, providing the storage, and running the databases. They are the muscle of the operation, even if they aren't the brain. They are providing the power, while Microsoft provides the permission. This is a perfectly sustainable position for AWS to hold for decades. They can continue to innovate in silicon, optimize for performance, and dominate in raw volume without ever needing to own the identity layer. They don't have to compete in every single category to be a vital part of the enterprise stack. The real question is whether AWS is actually comfortable with this arrangement. We have to wonder if they are okay being the utility layer that sits underneath another vendor's control plane. So far, their response has been to build their own governance tools like Control Tower and Guard Duty, which are excellent products in their own right. The problem is that those tools are AWS specific. They don't reach out and manage your Azure or on-premises environments, which means they don't actually abstract the infrastructure layer. They aren't designed to compete with Microsoft's cross-platform governance model because they are still fundamentally built to sell more AWS. For AWS to truly challenge Microsoft's control, they would have to fundamentally rethink their entire business model. They would have to stop being an infrastructure-first company and become a governance-first company. They would need a policy engine that treats AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud as equals. Nothing they've done so far suggests they have any interest in doing that. So the future looks like a division of labor. AWS will remain the best place to run a workload, dominating in compute, storage, and database maturity. But they will do so while operating underneath Microsoft's control plane. It's a world where AWS wins at the hardware level and Microsoft wins at the governance level. That isn't a loss for either side, it's just the new architectural reality. The hybrid operating model, the enterprise default. By 2027, the hybrid operating model will no longer be an aspirational goal or a messy exception because it is becoming the enterprise default. This is not a speculative prediction about what organizations should do, but a statement about what they will actually be doing to survive. To understand this shift, we have to look at how the model functions operationally, which is quite different from the traditional marketing definition of hybrid cloud. Identity now originates directly in Microsoft Entra ID rather than being synchronized from on-premises or federated from some aging legacy system. Entra ID acts as the absolute source of truth where users, groups, and roles exist natively in the cloud from the moment they are created. This makes identity the centralized foundation of the entire architecture. Policy enforcement follows a similar pattern by moving through Azure Arc and Defender to reach every corner of the environment. On-premises servers, AWS EC2 instances, and Google Cloud VMs all run the Arc agent, which allows them to appear in the Azure portal as standard managed resources. This creates a single policy framework where Azure policy and conditional access apply to every asset regardless of which infrastructure provider is actually hosting the hardware. Infrastructure has become interchangeable, allowing you to run workloads on AWS for compute pricing or Azure for M365 integration while keeping latency-sensitive tasks on-premises. While the underlying infrastructure remains heterogeneous, the governance layer is entirely unified. Unified governance means you operate with one identity system, one policy engine, and one audit trail across every cloud provider you use. Purview classifies data everywhere, while DLP and Sentinel monitor access and prevent leaks without ever caring about traditional infrastructure boundaries. Governance is no longer about where the data lives, but about how the policy is enforced. This model addresses the most painful problems facing the modern enterprise by ensuring compliance is never fragmented. Instead of managing separate audit trails for Azure, AWS, and local data centers, you maintain a single source of truth that makes compliance provable to regulators. Costs are optimized because you are no longer locked into a single provider, giving you the freedom to shift workloads based on current pricing or performance needs. You can keep predictable workloads on hardware you own while bursting elastic tasks to whichever cloud offers the best rate at that specific moment. Security shifts to an identity-first model where the network perimeter is replaced by Entra ID and conditional access. Every access decision is evaluated based on context, device compliance, and risk signals, which effectively prevents lateral movement by ensuring every single action is logged and auditable. Agility is preserved because you can swap infrastructure providers or migrate workloads between clouds without ever re-architecting your identity system or changing your policy framework. Infrastructure becomes a variable that you can change at will, while governance remains the only constant. AWS cannot provide this level of abstraction because they do not own the governance layer, whereas Microsoft owns the identity, policy, and compliance tools required to unify the stack. By abstracting the infrastructure layer, Microsoft has replaced it with a control plane that enterprises find functionally necessary. And this is the default reality for 2027, not because Microsoft is forcing the hand of the enterprise, but because the model solves the fundamental problems of cost, security, and compliance. Once an organization unifies its governance across a hybrid footprint, the cost of switching away becomes astronomical. Removing Entra ID or Azure Arc would mean dismantling the entire security and compliance engine of the company. The hybrid operating model locks enterprises into Microsoft's control plane through functional necessity, effectively making it the operating system for the modern business. The prediction: enterprise operating reality by 2028. By 2028, the cloud market will be completely reorganized around control planes rather than infrastructure providers. This shift is inevitable because of the architectural forces currently in motion across the industry. AWS will likely still dominate the world of cloud compute by running more global workloads and offering a broader service catalog than any of its competitors. For organizations building cloud-native applications from the ground up, AWS will remain the primary choice due to a structural dominance that is incredibly durable. Microsoft, however, will define the actual operating reality for the enterprise, which represents a much more fundamental type of dominance. By 2028, CIOs will measure their success through governance metrics instead of focusing on infrastructure statistics. They will stop asking how many workloads are running on AWS and start asking what percentage of access decisions are being evaluated by conditional access. The primary concern will shift from Azure compute spend to the number of data classification policies being enforced through Purview. Governance becomes the true measure of success while infrastructure is relegated to the substrate. Compliance will move from a manual process to an automated one, where organizations no longer spend months preparing for a single audit. Continuous compliance reports will be the norm, with Purview classifying data in real time and DLP preventing violations before they can even happen. Regulators will simply audit a live dashboard to see policy enforcement in action, making compliance a provable fact rather than a theoretical goal. Identity will fully replace the network as the primary security perimeter. Organizations will stop trying to defend network boundaries and focus entirely on the identity boundary, where every user and device is evaluated by conditional access. When every access request is authenticated through Entra ID and checked for compliance, the underlying network becomes architecturally irrelevant. Policy will be treated as code rather than a collection of Word documents or manual processes. Azure policy will enforce rules that propagate and remediate violations automatically, allowing policy to become version-controlled, auditable, and part of the standard infrastructure as code workflow. Hybrid setups will be the default for 90% of organizations, making single cloud environments a rare exception. The question will no longer be whether an organization should be hybrid, but rather which infrastructure providers can best fit within their existing hybrid governance model. AWS will adapt to this new reality by deepening its integration with Microsoft to offer better federation with Entra ID and stronger support for Defender for Cloud. It will become easier to project Azure governance onto AWS infrastructure as the two companies become more complementary. AWS will remain the preferred infrastructure layer, while Microsoft solidifies its position as the governance layer. The control plane will remain firmly in Microsoft's hands because AWS is not building a competing framework that can span across multiple clouds and on-premises environments. AWS remains an infrastructure-first company, while Microsoft has pivoted to a governance-first strategy, and that architectural gap is not going to close. By 2028, enterprises will see this arrangement as the optimal way to run a business. They might run 70% of their compute on AWS while managing every bit of it through the Microsoft control plane. There is no contradiction in this setup because it allows a company to use the best infrastructure alongside the best governance tools. This is the enterprise reality of 2028, where the conversation shifts from which cloud to how do we govern across all clouds. AWS will still be winning the infrastructure race, but Microsoft will be the one defining what winning actually looks like. Conclusion. The control plane is the battleground. AWS won the infrastructure war, and that is now a matter of historical record. They dominate cloud compute by running more global workloads than any competitor, and their lead in services and regions remains undisputed. AWS won. Microsoft is winning the control plane war, which is the battle currently deciding the fate of the enterprise. This is where identity, policy, and governance live, and it is exactly where Microsoft's gravity pulls the largest organizations. In the enterprise, the control plane is the only thing that matters, because infrastructure has become a commodity while governance remains scarce. By 2027, 9 out of 10 organizations will operate in hybrid environments where unified governance always beats distributed services. Microsoft owns governance, and while AWS owns infrastructure, the enterprise will always choose the path of unified control. Drop a comment if you think AWS can actually mount a control plane comeback. Subscribe for the architectural takes that nobody else is willing to give you.